welcome back to Anti-King, here with your daily reminder that if you find bones in your basement, you should probably tell somebody. We're back today with yet another horror you probably slept on, and it got me thinking, have you ever had someone come over and as much as you enjoy their company, at some point they've overstayed their welcome, and it's just such an awkward situation that rather than ask them to leave, you just have your stares eat them whole? Then you may just relate to today's antagonist, the Dagmars, as we're covering the 2015 genre-bending haunted house flick, We Are Still Here. The movie was created as an homage to The House by the Cemetery and other slow-burn horror movies of the 70s and 80s. It also stars horror icon Barbara Crampton. Barbara gained notoriety with one of my favorite horror movies, Reanimator. And funnily enough, I'll be talking about her quite a bit here in a couple days when I cover another forgotten 80s gem with Chopping Mall. Outside of Crampton, the film boasts a stellar cast that gives otherworldly performances in a movie that really hinges on exactly that. The movie subverts haunted house tropes and leaves a lingering sense of dread, all while thoughtfully exploring subjects such as grief and generational trauma. I often cite We Are Still Here as one of my top 5 favorite horror films, and I stand by that. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The movie begins with a gorgeous shot of a barren snow-buried field. We Are Still Here was shot on location in Shortsville, New York during the winter of 2014, and the director used the atmosphere and weather to help create a true feeling of isolation, much to the chagrin of the mostly Californian and Texan film crew. We pull out to the road with a long, winding shot of a car entering, and we're introduced to our main protagonist here, Paul and Anne, played by Andrew Sensenig and the aforementioned Crampton. Paul reassures Anne that they'll be arriving shortly to their new home and that the movers had taken care of everything. The movie introduces the house almost as a character of its own, with lingering and disjointed shots really hammering home that 70s aesthetic. The couple moves inside and we're treated to its vacuous and uninviting interior. There's a stillness that translates surprisingly well on camera here, coupled with a very lived-in feel. The set designer went above and beyond here to make the house really feel like a living entity, adding faux veins into the walls and having the house subtly swell and contract as if it was breathing. Anne takes a short tour and sets up a picture of their late son Bobby as Paul finds the bar. You see, Bobby is part of the reason they're here, or really Paul rather. Bobby passed away in a car accident and the resulting grief sent Anne spiraling into a depression. Paul hoped that buying a house in quiet rural New England would help Anne with her grieving process, which what? Sorry, Paul, but New England in the winter is about the most depressing place on earth. But then again, this movie probably wouldn't work at a timeshare in Miami, so they wind down their night with some 70s TV on their 70s couch before a 70s backdraft knocks down Bobby's photo, and we get a title card. And with that, the wick is lit, and the slow burn begins. While unpacking boxes, Anne hears a noise and investigates, which eventually leads her to the basement, which is a key location in this movie, and was genuinely creepy in real life. When the director first visited the house, he got such a bad vibe in the basement that he actually had to go outside to catch some fresh air. Furthermore, the couple that lived in the house told production members that when tearing down a wall in the basement during a remodel a few years back, they found a ton of bones, which by the way, they never reported to anyone. And the more I think about that, it actually kind of makes sense. Like, you don't want to be the guy in court having to explain why you had a bunch of bones in your basement. Anyways, she finds the basement empty and leaves, only to return when she immediately hears the noise again while messing with some of Bobby's old stuff. She pokes around with her flashlight, receiving a gust of hot air from a mysterious hole, before moving into a different section of the basement. Is that where the bones were? There, she finds Bobby's old baseball glove. Now, how in the heck did that get down here? She picks it up as a creepy shadow person leads her into another section of the basement, but that's where the bones were. She continues investigating and finds nothing. That is until we see the baseball she was just messing with upstairs roll down the basement stairs, and we see creepy shadow guy standing menacingly in the background. She picks up the ball, clearly shaken by what she mistakes as Bobby's presence.
I can feel him here.
Spoiler alert, no she doesn't.
What?
The next day, Anne tells her husband about how she can still feel Bobby, and that leaving the city didn't mean leaving the memories, and that he'd always be with him. Paul shuts this down, which upsets Anne. We cut to Paul making an angry dad phone call to someone complaining about the smell of smoke coming from the basement. Eventually, the voice on the other end of the phone agrees to send out an electrician, just as Anne stumbles in, showing Paul Bobby's broken picture from our opening sequence. Paul once again condescendingly shrugs off Anne's concern, writing it off to her grief. I think the writers used the parent shared grief as a wonderful plot device here, helping to explain their disbelief even as things gradually get worse. In our worst of despair, we as humans often have trouble discerning what is or isn't real, and throwing that mental incongruity into a haunting scenario was just brilliant in my opinion. We hear a knock on the door and Paul goes to answer. It's here we're introduced to my favorite character in the movie, Dave McCabe. He's played astonishingly by Monty Markham, who has said he only took this role as a way to dip his toe into the horror genre. And not only did he kill it, but he must have enjoyed it too, as much of his credited roles since this movie have been horror. They welcome Mr. McCabe and his wife Kat into their home, and they all sit and have tea as he begins to explain the house's sinister history. The house was built by the townspeople in 1859 for the Dagmars, who intended to use it as a funeral home. However, before long, the Dagmars began selling the corpses to the local university in Essex County and burying empty coffins, which is a direct reference to an H.P. Lovecraft story. When they were found out, the town ran the Dagmars out on a rail. Within the year, the Dagmar patriarch had drank himself to death. His wife leans in and frantically starts whisper fighting with him before he apologizes.
I'm so sorry. Here I am with you nice folks no more than 5 minutes and I'm already knee-deep in devils.
They rush out seemingly out of nowhere, stopping at the door to tell them that the house needs a family and that it's been 30 years since fresh souls have lived in that house. Which, by the way, what a weird thing to say. Paul thanks them for coming by their house, to which Dave replies,
It's still Dagmar's house.
And Kat sneaks Anne a note as they exit. Anne hands the note off to Paul, who opens it to a less than welcoming message. The locals sure do seem quirky. The next day, the electrician shows up to handle that pesky smoke smell in the basement. Paul shows him the basement, mystery hole and all.
Nothing back there?
Just some bones, probably. Paul takes off and lets the electrician get to work, telling him to call if he needs anything. Upstairs, Anne attempts to convince Paul to let their spiritualist friends Jacob and May come to the house to help them contact Bobby. Paul seems a little reluctant, but Anne already invited them. Meanwhile, our electrician, whose name is Joe, is having difficulties, dealing with power outages and creepy shadow people sightings. He goes to investigate a noise he hears, probably where the bones are, and finds a little girl. Oh, are you lost, little girl? Jesus Christ! Back upstairs, the couple is discussing their friend's plans to invite their son, and Bobby's old friend, out to the house as well. As they hear Joe cry out in pain from the basement, they investigate and find Joe unconscious, and that slow-burning wick gets a little shorter. We cut to a scene of Jacob and May driving into town. They lay on their character dynamics pretty heavy here, as the stony Jacob views this as a casual trip with friends, while May recognizes Anne's need for a friend who can help provide her with some sense of closure. I think it's also an interesting commentary on grief and how others react to their loved ones' grief. While it's almost always rooted in some kind of empathy, grief can drive the most emotionally adept of us away and bring the fixers ever closer. Anyways, they arrive at the house and greet Paul and Anne warmly, and judging by the blizzard-like conditions, I'd say it's welcome. What? After some awkward dead son small talk, they're off, driving around a teenage son by Wooden Indian. They finally stop in at a small diner, where the locals seem less than welcoming of their presence. It helps lend to the overall atmosphere and makes the behind-the-scenes revelation of how excited the people of Shortsville were to be in a movie all that much more great. They eventually take a seat in the corner as we cut to Jacob and May's son Harry and his girlfriend Daniela driving into town. They arrive at the house to a sweet little note written by Mom and Pops, welcoming them in and telling them to make something to eat if they're hungry. Aw. But the only thing they're hungry for is debauchery, as they break into the good liquor and start making out. Sinful. Soon, they're interrupted by a sound from the basement. Harry goes to investigate, but finds nothing but heat down there. That is, until creepy shadow person reveals himself to be creepy burnt up person, and plunges their thumbs through Harry's eyes as back at the restaurant May begins to choke. That slow-burning wick's getting awfully short. Daniela attempts to escape and appears to do so as she's driving down the street, but it's not long before a Dagmar appears in the back seat and rips her heart out in front of her in a kill that the director insisted on in order to subvert the haunted house trope of killings always taking place at nighttime. The two couples arrive home later that night to nothing noticeably out of place. They begin to settle in over some liquor as Jacob's attempts to legitimize his spiritualist beliefs with Paul is met with skepticism. Anne takes him upstairs and chastises him for being so close-minded, to which Paul agrees to be civil so long as Anne agrees to keep the drinks coming. We cut to the diner as the owner asks the new girl about the unfamiliar faces that came in earlier. The new girl explains that they're the new tenants at the Dagmar place before she's interrupted by a knock at the door. The new girl answers it and is shot dead, cold-blooded, as we start to unravel the villain Mr. McCabe truly is. The owner lets him in and he immediately chastises her, asking her if she realizes what would happen if they were to leave.
The town didn't realize it back in '49. And when that darkness didn't get a new family, it spread like a plague.
He goes on to explain that every 30 years, the Dagmars wake up to take revenge on whatever family is living in their house. They decide that if the Dagmars aren't going to take them, the town will have to kill them themselves. We cut back to the two couples casually lounging as May walks in back on her hippie bullshit.
I was feeling the most unreal energy in the hall.
Yeah, no, it's totally unreal, right?
Which Paul is having none of. I get it, Paul. They settle in as May tells them the house holds a darkness, and that she doesn't feel Bobby there. which upsets Anne. Paul goes angry dad a third time as he insists May contact Bobby like she promised. And you gotta feel for Paul, he's really doing his best to try and hold his wife together, even if he's not the most understanding person along the way. The next morning, the women both head out to get some groceries while Jacob and Paul stay at the house. It takes all of 2 minutes before the boys are setting up a full-fledged seance, and the girls have run into Mr. McCabe on their trip. May lays into him, asking him why she saw a family there last night if the town had run the Dagmars out. He has no answer, but is visibly concerned with the part about seeing a family. We cut back to Jacob and Paul, whose seance is now in full swing, candles and all. Jacob's in full-on seance mode too, as he's mixing up names and saying all kinds of silly stuff.
And so we ask Bobby to rot like wasted meat.
Jacob snaps out of it and frantically warns Paul it's not Bobby there with them before the candles are snuffed out and he's consumed by the entity. The next scene is possibly my favorite, because possessed Jacob is some spooky stuff. He spews some stuff about his family burning with a demonic voice before snapping to again and insisting Paul tie him to a chair before he's possessed again. Paul obliges and ties him up just as the women arrive home, as he's had a bit of change of heart from his previous skepticism.
Help! Jacob, May, I believe all of it.
May runs in to find her husband tied to a chair with a sock shoved in his mouth. Oh dude, you probably shouldn't. Oh, okay then. Demon Jacob goes on to explain he is possessed by Lazander Dagmar, and that his family was never ran out of town. Just then, Anne gets a call from Mr. McCabe's wife, Kat, who reminds Anne that she told her to leave as she's bleeding out profusely from a knife in her ribs. She tells Anne that the Dagmars aren't who they need to be worried about, which implies that her husband did this to her, which, god damn, dude. They run at the sound of commotion in the other room as May is running the fade on the reanimated Dagmar. They pull her off of him and he tells her how he killed their son. She collapses in a fit of grief just as Dagmar breaks his restraint and begins menacingly walking over towards her, lamenting his family's plight. He explains that his family was never ran out of town, and rather they were burnt alive as a sacrifice to the evil that lives beneath the house. He then grabs a fire poker and shoves it through his host body's eye, killing Jacob. Visibly unnerved, they attempt to flee the house when... Boom, motherfucker! The wick was attached to dynamite the whole time! This thing's about to be a gore fest! Mr. McCabe blows May's head off before Anne can shut the door and flee with her husband, as townspeople surround the house and begin to break in. They attempt to escape again before running into 2 extra crispy Dagmars in a hallway and rerouting upstairs. They close themselves into a bedroom upstairs as people begin to close in on them. All the while, Bobby's disembodied whisper shaking them to their core.
That was our son!
I know, I heard him! And he's telling us to fucking leave!
I mean, Paul's got a point. Meanwhile, the townsfolk finally make entry at the front door downstairs. They start to poke around as the hole in the basement seemingly comes alive. Soon, a Dagmar explodes a town person's ribcage, sending the others scrambling. Anne arms herself with a bunch of kitchen knives, dropping one through a grate and exposing her location. As that guy attempts to make his way upstairs to the couple, he's caught by a Dagmar and spin cycled to death. Paul and Anne creep nervously throughout the house, but are spotted by a man who, while attempting to catch them, is sucked into the stairs and eaten alive as the hole in the basement spews blood. It's a beautifully done practical effect, as you come to see they all are, that was achieved by dyeing mashed potatoes black and forming them into a stair shape over a hole in the stairs. They then use CGI to add the spark and ash and smoke effects. CGI is really at its best in horror when it's used to complement practical effects. They escape into another room as the bar owner from before attempts to find another way upstairs. Suddenly, the man she's talking to is dragged under the kitchen table and made a mess of. Paul and Anne begin discussing plans upstairs as a handful of townspeople flee. Good for them. The hole in the basement groans as the Dagmars continue their splatterfest, interrupted only by Mr. McCabe himself. He launches into a masterpiece of a speech that to me cements this movie as an all-time classic, as he derides the eldest Dagmar for not killing the family sooner. Meanwhile upstairs, the bar owner lady attempts to sneak up on Anne with some kind of sickle and receives a 5-knife salute to the neck. Her kill is one of those unintentionally funny ones as she collapses, neck spurting for a shot that lasts a little too long. They head downstairs and attempt to exit before an angry Mr. McCabe stops them at gunpoint. He tells them they won't be leaving, as they're here to satisfy the darkness. He launches into another iconic speech, as the Dagmar patriarch slowly creeps up on and crushes Mr. McCabe's head into nothing, finally winding down this tumultuous sequence. The couple and the Dagmar share an unspoken nod of agreement as something familiar draws Paul back to that basement door.
Hey, Bobby.
I rate these movies on tension, kills, score, acting, plot, and direction. Let's go! This movie is incredibly tense throughout, and would function in my opinion as one of the better all-time haunting movies, even without the completely unhinged final act. It does a good job giving us similar thrills and chills as other hauntings, while still managing to present something fresh. Any movie with outstanding practical gore effects will end up with a high rating here, and this is no exception. Mr. McCabe, May, the table scene, the stair scene, the 5-knife stabbing. This movie is packed with both memorable and creative kills. Not only does this soundtrack feature some absolute 70s inspired slappers, the score ratchets up the tension beautifully in empty spaces. I did dock at one point because I felt it could be more prominent in some places, but again, really another area this movie really succeeds at. Monty Markham's performance as Dave McCabe and Larry Fessenden's portrayal of a possessed Jacob are already in my head horror all-timers. Add in a solid performance by Andrew Sensenig as Paul, Lisa Marie as May, and a horror icon in Barbara Crampton, and you really can't ask for more. The movie borrows several of its plot points from several classic pieces of horror, without ever feeling disjointed or patched together. Instead, their inspirations inform the plot, and it comes together in a unique and captivating haunting story. The director establishes tone wonderfully throughout, with intersecting shots of barren, icy nothingness underscoring the isolation of a grieving family trying to escape their troubles in small-town America, as well as the isolation we often project onto ourselves when grieving. The shot selection is challenging and clever with an eye for contained chaos. That is 59 points out of a possible 60, which equals out to about a 98%, by far the highest in the series, and I don't think it's going anywhere. So yeah, a near perfect score from me, no surprise here. It is, in my opinion, outrageous that more people don't consider this an instant classic. I think top to bottom, it's an absolute masterpiece, and is easily one of my all-time favorite horror movies. Anyways, thanks again for watching everyone. If you haven't yet, please remember to like and subscribe. Maybe leave a comment on what you thought of We Are Still Here. As I said previously, I'm working on the next Forgotten 80s gem, Chopping Mall, so expect that in the next couple days. Followed at the end of the week by my video essay on Melancholia. Then I'm going to be a little less busy next week as I recoup creatively. But for what it's worth, the one video I am doing should be a fun one, as I return to this series to cover Terrifier. But until then, stay safe.